Okay, in this presentation, I want to go over the way I see the research process actually going down for people. Okay, and so just kind of explaining what, in my experience, and also as a matter of applying the ideas to practical, actually researching something. This is how I see the whole process going down, and what I've seen people do, what I've done, and I think it's important to understand that when you read a paper in a journal, these journal articles you're reading, when you read other people's stuff, you're not seeing the process, you're seeing the result, the final product. And so really there's a lot that goes into it. It's not so bad as making sausage or making laws, but there are some rough and ready pointers that I think you can get out of it that will be helpful. Okay, what do I mean by the research process? The way I see it, and this is me, this is kind of what I've observed and how I conceive of the process. I break it up into 3 stages. There's a preliminary stage where you're basically just trying to identify the topic and come up with your research question, right? So preliminary stage is kind of that searching stage that people go through. And it's many times the worst stage. People freak out depending on how much pressure is put on them about this research. Then you move, once you've decided what it is you actually want to do, you move into a preparatory stage where you develop a research design. And so you basically figure out how you're going to answer the question that you've posed. And that is, I think, a separate stage, because there's, it is very often, when people do theses or dissertations, it actually produces a written document that they have to defend to a panel of people. That's often part of the process. And then you have the research stage, where you actually go out and conduct the research, and you go do what you said you were going to do, conduct the research, draw your conclusions, and write your final paper. Right. In this course, you only have to do the first 2 stages, and it will result in a written document. But important safety tip, as I'm talking about all this, in this course, you just got to actually go through the first 2 stages. Okay, let's talk about this preliminary stage. A lot of times, people find it weird that I cut this out. Or students, especially when I had students who were, there was one point in my career where I was teaching students at the Special Warfare Center, and they were having to all do theses, master's theses, and they found it interesting that I pretty much like, as soon as I started teaching them, I told them about this. Hey, your preliminary stage it's sometimes the hardest, and it's where you're going to actually settle on a topic. And there seems to be an expectation among students that the topic springs to their mind fully formed. Oh, hell no. It is a long process, believe me. What goes into this? Well, it starts out with determining interest. What are you interested in? And this is where a student or a researcher will say, I am doing my paper on. They can complete that sentence. And they're going to, basically talk about a topic area. I'm going to do my paper on development in China, or I'm going to do my paper on the Crimean crisis. I'm going to do my paper on the Tea Party in American politics. That's all you got to do. it's a broad, and you're basically coming up with what I would call the topic, right? Or the topic area, if you will, to distinguish it from the final research question, okay? So that's the first thing. And to be honest, and when it comes to doing this, the only advice I can give, you must be interested in a topic to write a paper on it. If you're only going to write a research design, if you're not going to go through all the research, you still need to be interested in it. It's maybe not so critical. As to what you're interested in, I can't help you. I can't help anybody with this. I'm really like, nah, you really got to come up with this on your own. And so determining interest is purely student. Hopefully in the courses you've taken over time, there's something that stands out that you have some familiarity with, something in there. But really, it's up to you. Now, what I can tell you that's valuable is after that, it's not done. You're not done with the preliminary stage. Once you've got this idea, I'm interested in, Chinese, the economic development, Chinese and trade policy. Let's make it more international than that. All right. Well, now you have to go into the literature. And basically you go in, surf the journals online, basically go to JSTOR, which I'm having you do repeatedly in this course because, I'm trying to get you in the habit of that. And find out what have people been saying on this subject, right? This is how you deepen your knowledge. You got to find out what's already been done. And you find out, how the issues you're interested in have been broken up, right? What are the issues of the Crimean crisis or China's trade policy or whatever the topic is you're interested in? What are the things that people talk about? And then you also find out that they've defined, many times it'll define key concepts that you may need to use. And so that's helpful. You find what questions they've asked and how they've posed them. And most importantly, you find out what answers they've already given. Because you can't reinvent the wheel. Research is supposed to, we have two things that research is supposed to, well, amongst others. Research must be cumulative. It must build on what other people have done, but it must be original. It must go a little bit farther or in a different direction. So you need to survey the literature to find that. And also, you learn about the topic and you deepen your understanding of it. And so, this is the way you go about narrowing your interest, right? And so I say the thing you do is you have to narrow your interest. You have to focus on a particular aspect of the topic. Better to be an inch wide and a mile deep than the opposite. And very often this is what, this is where you start coming up with the research question, the thing you're actually going to do, the part you're going to focus on. This is very, very important to have a good research question. And the way I help people, I've typically cue people into it is, while you're doing this survey of the literature, is there something that these guys just aren't answering, right? Very often you read it and you have this nagging kind of, okay, you looked at this, but you didn't look at that. The second you say that, wow, bam, you're there. That's it. If you're pissed off but they've left something out or it just nags at you, that's gold. You bottle that because that's what you want to look at. Now, unfortunately, there may be reasons that these folks didn't look at that because it might be really hard, but sometimes they just are focused on something totally different. And so this is what comes out, right? Another way to do it is when trying to narrow it, if people are like, I don't know. Very often when you read on the subject, you start anticipating conclusions. You start to suspect something is going on. And you start to have some aspect of it that is there. And another time I say to people when are having trouble narrowing the topic down. There's so much to look at in this field. A lot of times, and everything is different. By the way, each student's process is idiosyncratic, meaning it on their own. They're unique. And I can tell you typical things that happen. And one thing that sometimes happens is the area is so broad and there's so many things, and students have trouble narrowing down, okay, what do I really want to look at? Sometimes I say to them, all right, let's say you're out at a party or talking to somebody at a bar, and this topic comes up. What's the one thing you want to thunder forth with and be able to confidently express this is the way the world is? What's the one thing you really are gonna want to look back and say, well, I did the research and the answer is. And that's another way that sometimes works for students. By the way, another thing that happens if you're looking at something new, like if you were looking at the Crimea, Russian annexation of the Crimea, you might find, there's nothing written on it. And in fact, if you were interested in explaining Donald Trump, well, a lot of scholarly work has not been done on Trump yet, right? At which point you go, well, all right, what do I do for my literature review? Well, I always say to people at that point, well, you have a couple options. One is you can go, and we'll talk about being descriptive, that, maybe you're going to have to just kind of say what happened rather than why. Another thing is, well, can you put what you're interested in into a general topic? If you're interested in the Russian annexation of Crimea, maybe you look at it as, well, maybe the topic area is what happened in other annexations or other separatist movements with Russia or other Russian wars. You make it you make what you're interested in a category, an element in a category that's more general. And so those are things that can come up. But basically, and like I say, I can't tell you how your event's going to, you start out determining your interest and then you do the research and you look at what other people have done and then you narrow it down. I mean, this is the process. It will be in broad terms, but the specifics depend on you and what you've picked and what you find. Okay, so that's the preliminary stage, and that's the stage that ends in you having a research question. And now, by the way, in terms of the course, when I say, here's a discussion exercise, tell me your research topic, I'm talking determined interest. Complete the sentence, I am doing my paper on, because that's the beginning of discussion. And so that's the first part. When I talk about a research question, that's the end of that stage, right? When it will include some survey of the literature as well. Can't pick a topic without researching it. Bottom line. Okay, a big thing along the way, you want to identify your dependent variable, right? And so I've covered this before. The dependent variable is the thing being explained, the thing you're interested in, the thing denoted as y and all the statistical stuff. And you're going to be searching for the independent variables, the things that are thought to affect the dependent variable. Those are the things, and we talk about creating a model all right, what are the 5 things that determine the dependent variable? Or what are the elements of the story that gets the ending of the dependent variable? So you want to, like I say, big thing in this first stage, your interest is the dependent variable. You're going to narrow that down a little bit to be sure. But then you're also going to be looking for what are the possible independent, what have people said are the independent variables in your literature review. I don't know if that helped at all, but you've got to be able to shift into these terms to write the paper. Okay, in the preparatory stage, some development of the question continues. All right, you're going to work on it. Sometimes you are going to define concepts, and you need to define them in ways that are measured. you definitely need to make sure you're posing your question in a way that can be answered, right? And you have to get out there and say, all right, you have to be able to say, this is why there's so much emphasis on hypotheses, on stating things in a way that is, testable. Because if it's testable, well, it can be tested. And so, one of your problems, if you have a vagueness to what you're looking for, if you're trying to say, well, is climate, the one example from the text, which is blocking all the other good ones that I might have come up with, is climate change caused? Do humans cause climate change? That might be tough, and so you might have to say, well, have we seen a correlation between human activity and a certain indicator? Right now, that would be terrible for this. It's not political science, but you have to make sure that when you're doing the research, that you're coming up with an answer. Let me give you an example of this, sort of in this vein. I did my PhD dissertation on the effectiveness of international sanctions, and I laid out in my research design that at the preparatory stage, right? I laid out, I want to look theoretically at how sanctions are supposed to work, identify the conditions under which they can be effective, and then go out and look at cases and test this. And the research committee said, well, Dave, that's great, but what if you are unable to determine theoretically conditions under which sanctioning will be effective? And I said, oh, then I'm done. Because if I can't theoretically derive questions about sanctions, if I can't theoretically come up with the circumstances in which they ought to be effective, then they're not effective. And we shouldn't expect them to be. And I can stop at the theoretical, because that contradicts a lot of, I went through people who had said these are the conditions. If I don't find those to be the case, then I've come up with a different result. And in fact, by the way, that's exactly what happened, because I came up with, hell, no way these frickin' things work. And so not in the way that they're supposed in that model, the economic sense. So that was, you have to make sure that, hey, as you go through this, are we going to actually get an answer? And are we going to get and that's why, again, like I say, the importance is on a test. Can I get a thumbs up or thumbs down on whether this is, a go or no go, whether it supports the ideas of the theory or not. And you always got to consider, like I did, I considered possible alternatives. What if you don't find what you expect to find? Is that interesting? For instance, if you went out and tried to show that the astrological signs of presidents have an effect on economic prosperity, you would probably end up finding nothing. You would probably find, no, there isn't an effect. At which point I'd be like, is that interesting? No, because everyone knew it at the beginning. There was no reason to think that it had an effect in the first place, right? And so, you got to game out. Hey, sure, if I could prove, if I could find evidence, you never prove anything, but if I could find evidence that there was a relationship, that would be quite startling, but I'm likely not to. And so if I get a negative result, I don't want to have nothing to show for it, right? So you always want to have your alternatives. You want to, and by the way, the only way that astrological thing would work is if somebody out there had credibly in the literature been arguing that it did make an effect. Then you could say, oh, well, if I don't find it, then I just, I provide counter evidence to this part of the literature. That would be interesting. That would be okay. Okay, so that's developing the question. In designing the research, you are going to actually have to say, okay, how do I find and test these answers, right? And what's this, you have to set standards for success. What is, if, how do I know if I pass the test or not? And sometimes that's, okay, if there's a positive relationship predicted between the independent and dependent variable, that's the standard. But there were times where, people were looking at it. For instance, I had a student who did a thesis on the military coup, the supposedly revolutionary coup in Peru in the 70s. And the military took over the government and claimed that they were doing, instead of it being a right-wing reactionary coup, they were revolutionary. They were going to bring the country forward. And the student was interested in what, his question was this revolutionary? Was that coup, in fact, they claimed it was, but was it revolutionary? And I said, all right, well, we need to define that concept. What do you mean by revolutionary? And then how are you, you could probably find evidence that it was and evidence that it wasn't. What's the standard, right? And what we came up with, and this was all part of the design, and these were actually discussions I had with a student as he was working on it, was, all right, well, let's look at, go in and identify the things they were trying to achieve that would be revolutionary if they tried to achieve them. And, he derived those by kind of looking at their statements and what they claimed they were going to do. And then, all right, let's compare how they did on land redistribution, on education, or, whatever. He had a list. I can't recall it now, but, and then look how they did before and after and compare it. And like I said, if that's obvious, because doing that, but, the problem with that is, well, you'll get kind of mixed results. And so the standard was, let's compare it to the region. Compare it to, he compared it to Latin America in general. And then for fun, compared it to, the Chilean, he compared their coup to Pinochet's coup in Brazil to say, well, did they outperform the obviously reactionary guy, Pinochet? And so he compared them to the region and for argument's sake, to Pinochet. And that was the standard for success, right? Are they revolutionary? Well, did they do better than the region, or did they, how did they compare? And in the end, he ended up with mixed results, but the design didn't, that is to say, they failed in some areas and succeeded in others, but it was less vague because we had set a benchmark, and we could say on this category, on education, they did a little better than the region. So yes, they were revolutionary. And this one, they didn't do so well. So, in the end, it was an ambiguous answer to it, but it was nevertheless, that was the point. Their results were ambiguous, but our tests and the way he did it wasn't ambiguous. We could say concretely where they succeeded and where they failed. Does that, and hopefully that makes sense. That's one of the ways I'm talking about. What are your standards for success or failure? What are the standards for you to say yes or no to the question you've posed? Also, a big part of this area is the last two. You operationalize your variables. You say, how am I going to measure? You identify the variables, you operationalize them, and you identify where you're going to get the data on that. All right? You got to be able to say, I will, get the data from the World Bank, or I will get the data from Opinion Research, or for Gallup. Right? You have to show that data exists. Right? And where are you going to go? Where are you going to get it? And you're going to outline the steps in what you're going to do. And this is what you've got to do. You write this up, and that's what you present in this course. Okay? So that's as far as you really have to go. Now, I've mentioned that there are types of studies. One type of study is descriptive. That's where you just are going to analyze what's going on, what happened, and you're basically just trying to look at things and say, and in the say in the Mueller paper on Vietnam, that was descriptive. He was simply saying what happened, and what happened was that the casualties were freaking huge, and that in comparison to the rest of the world, history, very few people have ever suffered as much as the Vietnamese people did in the war. And so that's a descriptive piece. In the Mueller piece on trends, he found that, actually, we have a relationship. We're now not looking just at one thing. We're looking at a relationship between two or more variables, right? So time versus support, or as he came up, casualties versus support. So that was a relational study, right? These are better. We like these, right? Even better, we like causal ones, where we determine whether or not one variable causes things. So right, we can look at a relational study. And in my example here in the slide, opinion polls, right? If we just horse race who wins in a poll, right? We can look at polls and say, all right, this is what happened. In relational things, when we start, if we compare how men versus women vote, well, now we've got a variable in there, right? Or educated versus less educated people, white people versus black, Hispanic, ethnic groups. Once we start separating out and relating two variables together, we are now in the realm of a relational study. But then we want to get to causal. What are the causal effects? And, do things actually have an effect? And how does it occur? And very often the difference between relational and causal is whether or not you've got a good idea why the independent variable should cause it. If you've got this theoretical explanation, which is why I spent so much time talking about theory, and we want to explain. For instance, why do men and women vary? Right? Explain that. Don't. I'm not going to give you an explanation because it's not. It's very complicated. Now you probably could. We could get into psychologists and stuff, but we can just see men. Men support one candidate. They tend to support. They'll support one candidate more than another than women will. All right, we're going to leave that alone because it's not so clear. On the other hand, I have effective campaigns on voting, right? We could say, do the campaigns. We could say, how does that affect the outcome, right? So can we look at, can we measure campaigns, and can we look at, how do we operationalize campaigns? Well, we could say the amount of money spent. We could talk about the amount of volunteers. We could talk about the amount of advertising. In fact, we might narrow it down to a particular portion of campaigning. Does negative campaigning, do negative ads have an effect? And if we go and we look at, say, the number of negative ads in a campaign across campaigns, and so we have a lot of different campaigns with variation in the independent variable, more negative advertising in some than others, and then we look to see who won, right, and what the outcome was, and we find a relationship, we find a correlation that negative campaigning looks like it does produce an outcome. At the end of the day, we would consider this causal, but statistically, the difference between comparing, the effect of gender on vote and the effect of negative advertising on vote, statistically, it's the same thing. We'll do the same stuff. It's just that in the case of the the effect of negative advertising, logically, yes, this has an effect because it's a freaking negative ad. That was what we're supposed to do, right? There's no question. It's just so obvious. And sometimes it's maybe not as obvious. Sometimes maybe it's the fact that we have a lot of theoretical work, right? And in fact, you could probably go at the gender issue and start pulling it apart if you got into research, if you were not. The problem with it, the problem you get into with the gender stuff is a lot of times you're off the top of your head stuff is in grave danger of being stereotypical, right? And so we can start talking about, why men and women will differ, but we don't want this to be like a stand-up comic or a bigot or, I don't know where we go with it, but the thing is, if you go into the research, you start digging in and saying, well, no, people have looked at this and what we see are, whatever, right? Whatever the researchers think is at play. And then maybe we could go and look to see if there's some testable hypothesis that we could see, hey, is that actually why women are supporting this candidate more than men are? And there is research on this field. Just, you've got to have more complex, more, I want to say more deep, but that is so bad. You have to have more depth to the ideas behind it. As opposed to, like I say, if you're looking at campaigns, it's something that's obviously meant to affect the outcome. All right, we kind of have a prima facie case. We don't have to go too deep. Causality very often is simply driven by your explanation of why you think, how good your explanation for why you think the independent variable causes the dependent variable. That when you find a relationship, it holds together. Okay, there are two styles of research, and I had presentations on this before. Maybe out of sync. Maybe I should have held on to them till now. You have quantitative, where we're looking at numbers, measurements of specific, well-defined, and limited variables. And this is where we're into testing hypotheses, right? So this is all the stuff the Pollock textbook or any textbook on statistics, most textbooks on methods will focus you, right? This is what you do. There's also this qualitative way. And qualitative research is still empirical. We're still looking at the world, but we're going in and we're not measuring things per se. We're collecting information and relating it, and we're trying. A lot of times, you're keeping it in context. You're not making it numerical. You're saying, all right, well, these people say this. Maybe you're doing a case study, but you're relating a lot of information still in context. And in this case, very often in a qualitative study, the variables are unspecified at the beginning. They're certainly less well defined. And very often in qualitative research, you're searching for the independent variable. In quantitative research, you use the theoretical research or other people's research to suggest independent variables, to suggest hypotheses for testing that you then go test against the data. Very often qualitative research is focused on simply identifying what you think the contenders are for an independent variable, for a cause to the effect that you're interested in explaining. And so and when when do you do quantitative? Well, it's when the topic area has been hashed over. We have some good theory. We've talked about what we think the variables are, and we've got data. People don't collect data on something until there's a reason to, and so very often in a field where something has been studied a lot, certainly with voters, this is the case. There's a lot of things that have been measured, and we can actually use them as indicators for variables. And so the more developed the field, the more likely it is you're going to have a set of specific, well-defined variables that you can pick from and have data for. Less developed, fields, you're left to do the qualitative stuff. So it's often driven by the topic. I am going to tell you, by the way, if you can angle yourself into an area where you would do quantitative research, a quantitative research design is a lot easier to write than a qualitative one. Keep that in mind. Okay, then we get to the research stage. This is where you collect data and analyze it. Now, you don't have to do it in this course. Okay, so maybe I shouldn't spend too much time, but I want you to know this, that when you do research and you've gone through all the design, you collect the data, you do it, you analyze it. At this point, it's just tedious work. Collecting the data is often difficult depending on what you're doing and how you're doing it, and going through it and analyzing it. Sometimes you actually have to go back to the preparatory stage and change things because you find, I have data for this. The thing I want the data for, I have that, but I don't. When I was going through writing my dissertation, my friend Fiona McGillivray was a classmate of mine. She was doing research on trade restrictions and laws, and her idea was that the type of system, whether you had a proportional representation system for electing members of the legislature versus a district system like we have in the United States, where you elect a person to represent a particular geographic area, that mattered. That made a difference in the types of tariff laws and protection you got. And so she had data on the United States. That was going to be her example of the geographic district. Now she needed data on trade and votes, and she needed a lot of stuff for a parliamentary system, and or for a proportional representation parliamentary system. And getting that data, she just went back and forth. Was it going to be Europe? Was she going to get data for France or for countries in Europe or Canada? And, and she had one set of data was like $1,500, which for graduate students was prohibitive. And so she kept going, she had to obviously change the research design depending on where she actually could find the data. And that was kind of a nightmare. Again, not a problem for y'all, because you can just, if it exists, you don't have to actually get it. But sometimes you have to go back to the preparatory stage and say, oh, well, maybe this didn't work out. And so there's sometimes backtracking and readjustment as you encounter obstacles. Then you do the research, and then you draw your conclusions, right? And you, at this point, you were testing these hypotheses for a reason. If you've done you already should know. There really aren't surprises here. You identified what heads means and what tails means, right? So when the coin is tossed, the surprise is whether it's head or tails, but not what it means. And you knew you had a choice to kick or receive, and so all right, we're kicking. Shouldn't really be startling to you. At that point, I've oversimplified it a bit, but and then when you get those things, you start thinking, okay, well, what's this mean to the world? And in writing conclusions, you got to push your implications as far as they go, and that's why one reason I had the casualties in Vietnam thing by Mueller, because I felt he just took that one conclusion and he milked it for some implications. And then typical thing we do, we suggest, all right, where could we go from here? You suggest things for future research. And the message, though, here is that these conclusions are all drawn, and then you write your paper. And I know you're not going to write the paper, but this is a good thing to keep in mind, is that the writing of the paper is done after you've come to all these conclusions. And so the paper reports not the process, but the final conclusion. And that's why these guys all sound so smart. It's because they're done. And so they start from the beginning. They know where they're going to end, and they lay out this process. For researchers, reading journal articles can be very intimidating because they are, you've selected this bunch that have all had a result. They're all writing as that. And by the way, in journal articles, a researcher will submit an article. It will get reviewed by a panel of people who will then make suggestions. They rarely just say, oh, it's perfect, publish it this way. They usually make suggestions, oh, you didn't consider this and you didn't consider that. And so they'll accept it, revise, and resubmit. And so the researcher goes back, fumes for a day or two about these idiotic reviewers' comments. Then, if they're smart and they want to be published, slavishly adhere to the suggestions of these guys. And, as one of my professors said to someone who was complaining about how the reviewer didn't know what he was talking about, he said, well, are you interested in proving you're right, or do you want to be published? At which point the discussion ended and the reviewer's comments were, you dealt with it. And then they go back and they resubmit, and then they go to a copy editor who then annoyingly changes all the writing, says, oh, you said this, and they go through so many iterations before being published. And I've actually worked at a journal and seen what came in and then saw what got published. Huge difference. And it's kind of like when a band has one hit on their album, and I've heard in the music industry, they will tend to identify the song that they think will be the hit, and then they produce the living crap out of that thing. And so it sounds very different, right? Because they'll maybe recut it, they'll bring in other folks, and very often that one will just stand out from all the others that they didn't really have expectations for and didn't work as hard on. And so with these articles, they have had a lot of work done. The author has submitted it and then revised it with this expectation, when you think it's actually going to get published, you really work on it, and then has gone with a copy editor over the language and so these things get a lot of work. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're reading them, by the way. Okay, general comments. Looking at this, you guys don't, yay, you don't actually have to do the research, you just got to write a research design. But topic number 1 is selecting the topic and framing the question is half the battle. So it takes half the time. And I always said to students, it doesn't seem like it should be that way, but it is. And if it's not half the time, it's certainly half the worry. It takes research to properly ask the question. That is so important. You've got to go in, once you get a topic, you've got to go in and start reading on it. What have other people done? And take notes. When you do that, make sure you collect the bibliographic information for everybody you read. Don't read it until you have cut and pasted the bibliographic information. And God, JSTOR, you hit citation, it gives it to you in the already formatted. You cut and you paste that to a file and you hang on to it before you read. This is advice I follow, because later on you'll be, where'd that come from? And you'll be pissed that you don't have it in your head. But you read a few articles, and the scholarly articles, I know they're annoying and tough, but they are the ones that also tell you who they have their own literature reviews. And very often you get one on your topic, and then you're reading and they're talking about these other two guys' books, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. And, you may not, in this course, you're probably not going to get the book, but you can find out, you can look for journal articles by the same people. Because remember, before they publish a book, they usually have a couple journal articles on the subject. And basically you're able to backward, to search out, and, kind of doing a scavenger hunt to find other things on the topic. right? And so that's the stuff you've got to do. It's not bad. It's surfing. It's not really onerous, and it's often interesting. Just make sure, like I say, while you're doing it, you're keeping track, putting together your reference list, maybe now and then taking notes, and with electronic art, you can cut and paste it, just remember where it came from and make sure you're capturing all the information to cite it properly later on, and you're good to go. But you have to get into that kind of mucking around in the stuff, immersing yourself in it to answer the question. The question you ask determines the shape of your research. There's no box to check. There's no cookie cutter. I'm not going to give you a format, because it just, it can't be done, right? It's an organic process, if you will. It feeds it creates its own path. But in the end, good research analysis requires structure and focus. That's why we're having you write a research design, because that's the hard part. Once you have that structure and focus, because if you have a good research design, that's your structure and focus. That's your plan. That's what you're going to do. Don't need you to actually do it, right? You could, but if you can lay out the structure, that will get you where you need to go. Finally, the theoretical framework. A lot of times you do, and that goes back to doing the research to ask the question. You really want to have a good reason to think X causes Y, that an independent variable is related to the dependent variable. And if you get some theoretical articles on your topic, they do the great thing of identifying the independent variables for you. And they basically strip, it's in that storytelling, we strip out extraneous events, right? And so we take a story, we take Moby Dick and reduce it to 2 chapters because that's all there is that's in the story, really. Yes, there is a chapter on the whale being white, but it's more about why white is scarier than black, as the white things are more frightening because they shouldn't be scary, but they are. The whole chapter on that. Strip that crap out of Moby Dick. That's what theory does for you. Theory says, this is what you got to look at. These are the things that everything else is noise. Ignore the man behind the curtain, right? This is what's important, and this is the information you should be focused on. And you're off to the races. You just got to find it, come up with a proposition, say, well, here's the data, here's the hypothesis I'll test, and here's the data, and boom, I'm done. Give me my A. So don't neglect the theory. Okay? Hope that explains kind of where you're going and what your final project is. It's still a long way off, but I hope that kind of lays out in your head a better what you need to do. Specifically, to be more specific about it, we're only doing the preliminary preparatory stages. We have a DX coming up where you're going to pick a topic. That's where you're going to say, okay, I'm doing my paper on. Then later on, and look at the syllabus for this, because I use these lectures repeatedly for courses, and I don't want to change a week and then have to redo the whole thing. But there's another assignment that's going to have you do part of your literature review. Hey, tell me some stuff. And so it's going to, it's kind of forcing you that week to do the literature review. Also, it's saying, hey, the amount of effort you would have normally put into the DX, let's put it into the paper. So I'm trying to help you out here. And if you can get to the research question at that point, great. And then we can talk about it and get some feedback. And so that kind of moves you forward. And then from there, it's a jump to the research design, right? That's your final assignment, which you have to do the last day of the course. So broken this whole thing up, tried to, provide opportunities along the way because it is a long process. And hopefully this is very, very doable for you in the end.